ادامه جلسه رو خدمتتون عرض میکنم که چون آقای سخنران بعدیمون آقای دیوید دیپیو این ساعت سخنرانی براشون مناسب نبود از نظر زمانی، ترجیح دادن که سخنرانی رو ضبط کنیم ما از پیش و الان فقط فایل ضبط شده سخنرانی ایشون رو ما پخش خواهیم کرد. امیدواریم که البته تا پایان سخنرانی ایشون حالا بیدار بشن. دوست داشتن که این کارو بکنن. ببینیم اگر بتونیم که ایشون هم به صورت زنده در هنگام پرسش و پاسخ داشته باشیم که میتونن به صورت زنده به سوالات شما جواب بدن. اگر نه میتونید سوالاتتون رو در قسمت کامنت بنویسید برای ایشون. همچنین سوالاتی رو که از بنده دارید یا از آقای دکتر صمدی دارید بنویسید که بعد از سخنرانی آقای دیپیو ما به سوالات خواهیم پرداخت. خب معرفی میکنم سخنران بعدی رو، آقای دکتر دیوید دیپیو، استاد بازنشسته ارتباطات در دانشگاه آیوا که خب البته دیگه در آیوا نیستن و رفتن در شهر اورگن. به این دلیل هم بود که گفتن این ساعت دیگه مناسب نیست. این ساعت الان صبح خیلی زود هست، ساعت 5:06 صبح هست برایشون و به این دلیل آقای رضا اسماعیلی دانشجوی دکترا در امریکا محبت کردن و کمک کردن این سخنرانی رو آقای دیپیو ضبط کردن. آقای رضا اسماعیلی همچنین کمک کردن و سخنرانی آقای فیلیپ اسلون رو هم ضبط کرده بودن که در صورت ایجاد مشکل در هنگام پخش بتونیم ما پخش شده سخنرانی رو خدمتتون ارائه کنیم که احتیاجی پیدا نکردیم دیروز. در هر صورت از آقای رضا اسماعیلی تشکر میکنیم. امیدواریم که دکتراشون رو با موفقیت تموم کنن و ما در خدمت خودشون هم باشیم در روزهای داروین سالهای بعد. من دیگه وقتتون نمیگیرم، توجهتون رو جلب میکنم به ارائه آقای دکتر دیوید دیپیو با همین عنوانی که میبینید.
I'm very, very happy to make this presentation, and I thank you very much for your invitation. I'm going to talk about the rhetorical strategy of Darwin's Origin of Species. So the first question is, what is rhetoric? So here's a definition. Rhetoric is discourse addressed to an audience by a speaker or a writer in response to a problematic situation that the speaker wants to change. Rhetoric, unlike other forms of discourse, makes very extensive use of metaphors and other figures of speech, and it makes appeals to emotion. For these reasons, it's often thought that rhetoric is merely decorative, but what I will be arguing, and is a common view in America, is that rhetoric is a kind of argumentation, and I'm going to try and apply that to Darwin's Origin of Species. So I'm going to discuss Darwin's Origins of Species in the light of the semi-field or subfield called Rhetoric of Science. Now, rhetorical analysis was developed in ancient times, in particular in Greece, in order to teach the art of political speech-making. But it can be applied to scientific inquiry. Here's a passage from Richard Whately in 1828 that says exactly that. Even the philosopher, by which he means scientist, the word scientist had not yet been invented, even the philosopher who undertakes to convey his notions to others assumes for the time being the character of advocates of the doctrines he maintains. And since he's going to be an advocate, or he or she assumes all of the apparatus of rhetorical argumentation. And my claim that I want you to bear in mind is that when rhetorical analysis is applied to scientific works, you can see things that you otherwise wouldn't see. Now, here's a little bit of a trick. I want you to distinguish between the actual Darwin the person, and the textualized Darwin, who is the speaker of the book called Origin of Species. Now, it's a distinction I'm sure that you're familiar with. For instance, you know perfectly well that in a work of fiction, like a novel, you might have a male author and a female speaker, narrator. Or conversely, you might have a female author with a male speaker. It's a little bit of a trick to apply that to Rhetoric of Science, because you would naturally want to say that the speaker is in fact the historical Charles Darwin. But I want you to just make a thought experiment this way and look at it as if it were a novel where you're distinguishing between the textualized author and the actual author. So basically, the first line here says you have the Darwin on the left, who puts himself into the origin speaker. And when you have a text, it also not only has an implied speaker, it has an implied audience. And then outside of the implied audience is the real audience. So you have to think of a text as somewhat self-contained, just as a kind of thought experiment, because even though it's somewhat artificial, by doing this, you'll see things that you otherwise find it difficult to see. So in fact, over time, Darwin's real audience gave him lots of feedback after first publication of the Darwin in 1859, December 1859, which is the first edition. And they gave lots and lots, the real audience gave lots and lots of feedback, primarily in the 155 reviews and newspapers and learned journals. So now we have a representation of that. The real audience talks back to the real Darwin. And his responses to these objections and difficulties are contained in textual changes in the 6 revised editions, or 5 revised editions. There were 6 editions in total. So now we have a schema that says Darwin, the real Darwin, the implied author of editions 2 through 6, and the implied audience of each one. And since he is very concerned to deal with these objections, the 6th edition, which appeared in 1872, is almost twice as long as the first. And also, I want you to bear in mind, in the later editions, the voice of the implied author changes. Well, here is a picture of the young Charles Darwin. Bear that image in mind. That's younger than the man who wrote Origin of Species. That's taken about the time that he undertook the 5-year trip on the ship Beagle, a world tour, a biological tour. Took him to the Galapagos, South America, all kinds of places. Now, I want to back up here and give you some qualities, characteristics of the real Darwin. He was a scrupulously honest English gentleman. He was a close observer of facts. He was good at knowing what he knew and what he didn't know. He was very committed to his theory. He was aware that his devout wife, Emma, worried about the effect of his belief in evolution on his salvation in the afterlife. Emma could not stand the idea that Charles and her and their dead children, they'd already suffered several deaths of children, she could not stand the idea that they would not be united in the afterlife. And she worried about the effect of his belief in evolution. And even more, his making it public. He was fearful of the disrepute of earlier evolutionary writers, especially of a book that appeared in 1844 by a man named Robert Chambers. Actually, it appeared anonymously first because it was that controversial a topic. But after a while, people figured out that this was a journalist named Robert Chambers, and the book was called Vestiges of Creation. He was averse to conflict, preferring his friends to defend him. And he was reluctant to identify differences between him and his defenders. And here I give you a list of his principal first-generation defenders: Thomas Henry Huxley, Alfred Russel Wallace, and Herbert Spencer. So why don't you review those for a minute, and then I'll go to the next slide. Now, we're going to turn to the characteristics of Darwin's implied audience. Implied audience. Darwin's implied audience is what Wallace called the general naturalist public. That means ordinary readers, people who would pick this up in a bookstall in a railway station. It was not his expert cohort of biologists. That's the implied author. The implied audience is assumed to believe in creationism. Creationism here I'm defining as species don't come from other species, but directly from God. Why would this audience, the general naturalist public of England, Scotland, why would they come equipped with a belief in creationism? Because 18th century Great Britain had an ideological commitment to something called natural theology. That is, its political authority rested on theological evidence of providential care as seen in his creation. So if you look at books by like William Paley, Evidences of Natural History, you'll point out all the ways in which little parts of organisms are adapted to other people or other parts. Organisms are adapted to their environments, and organisms in an ecology are adapted to each other. And the general view was, how could mechanistic laws, like the laws of physics, ever create such a thing as this functional adaptedness of the parts of organisms and the functions of organisms to each other? And the idea was, no, it can't be. God has to be doing it. Darwin's book was scandalous because he said, I can show you a natural mechanism by which adaptation can occur. Anyway, back to the question of the characteristic of the audience. They are assumed to be creationists. Now, expert biologists, geologists, are addressed indirectly in The Origin. They are assumed to, quote, quote, overhear his case for descent from a common ancestor and be persuaded by how persuasive he is to ordinary readers. Think about that for a minute. He's making his case indirectly to his peers by having them overhear an argument to the ordinary readers of England who are assumed to be creationists. And he's going to see if he can get them to agree with him, even in the face of their received creationism. In fact, however, if you think about it, expert biologists and geologists were the primary audience of the real Darwin. That's who he was really trying to persuade, but he went about it in an indirect way. And I know why, too, because he's trying to show that experts can become evolutionists, too, because they don't have to fear the public. You can make a good enough case to the public that they will agree with you. Okay, what about the qualities of Origin's textual author? That is the Darwin that's in the book. Well, the first thing is that he expresses goodwill to his readers. An ancient author, Cicero, says that goodwill toward the audience is the primary virtue of a good public speaker. A good public speaker will compliment the audience. People who don't like his speech will say he's flattering them, but that's just the same thing put negatively and positively. Goodwill. He expresses a great deal of goodwill to his readers. He sympathizes with how hard his implied audience will find what he says. He says he initially felt that way too, and that's why it's easy for him to imagine their resistance. Another way to compliment or express goodwill toward an implied audience is to anticipate their objections and respond graciously to them. So the origin contains anticipations of and answers to objections at the end of several chapters. He says, I know you're thinking this, but think about the following. In addition, the whole of chapter 6 of the first edition is devoted to replies to difficulties, such as how hard it is to imagine the intricate eye as a product of natural selection. The implied author does not generally ridicule objections as absurd, because if he did, that would show contempt, not goodwill, and he doesn't do that. He's very open to his audience's views. The only idea he ridicules is that of a God who has to scurry around filling up holes in his creation whenever extinctions occurs. His idea of a God as a God has the dignity of not having to be plugging holes in the creation as extinctions occur. And he would like to find a way to defend the dignity of God without having that difficulty. You can understand from this, by the way, how the proof that extinctions did occur, which had been taken, that would have been pretty much established by about 1750. So the existence of extinctions is a very important background assumption of the origin of species, and nobody really doubted it by then. And this means, the slide is called Natural Selection is Sublime, that the speaker builds into his picture of natural selection the providential care for animals and plants, for human beings, and for the state. The speaker builds into his picture of natural selection the providential care that he knows that the implied author associates with God. In other words, he attributes to natural selection a property of God that he knows the audience attributes to God. And in order to explain this, I have to back up a second and make sure that everybody understands what natural selection is. Now, I know that there's been many talks before me that have focused on this idea, and you probably already know about natural selection before you even came to the conference. But anyway, what it means is the non-random transmission of heritable characteristics to successive generations. So the variations on which natural selection works are random. They occur by chance. They don't occur with an end in view. But they can be shaped by natural selection over periods of generations so that the organisms that result are better adapted to their environments. That's what I mean by natural selection, and I think that's what Darwin meant by natural selection. And here's a great famous passage from chapter 4 of The Origin that proves this, that this is what Darwin has in mind. And I'm going to read it slowly because it's written in Victorian English, which isn't the kind of style we use anymore. Man selects only for his own good. He's referring there to what breeders of plants and animals do. They always pick the best of the litter and then add that up generation after generation with some startling results. Look at the number of kinds of dogs there are. One species, all these different variations. Man selects only for his own good. Nature only for the good of the being which she tends. How fleeting the wishes and efforts of man. How short his time. And consequently, how poor will his products be compared with those accumulated by nature during whole geological periods. Daily and hourly, natural selection is scrutinizing every variation even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad and adding up all that is good. Beautiful passage. Now, if some of you know English well enough, you'll understand that there are echoes in this passage of biblical texts, of the language, the style that's used in the Bible. And they're not like quotes or anything, they're just the style of the King James translation of the Bible, which every Englishman knew pretty much by heart, large parts of it anyway. So he's trying, this implied author, he's trying to convince his implied audience that natural selection is, in a way, doing as good as God, if not better than God, in making species adapted to their environments and to each other. So my conclusion there at the end of this slide is comparing natural to artificial selection, that is plant and animal breeding, and expanding time a lot. Natural selection makes natural selection appear as sublime as the biblical God. So let me review for a minute. He has complimented his author by assuming their premise and then in effect turning it upside down, preserving the assumptions about God that they bring with them, but actually transferring them to natural selection. So throughout the text, if you read it, the first edition, throughout the text, the implied author is slowly shifting the burden of proof from the quote, quote, ordinary doctrine, the creationist doctrine, to his own theory of natural selection. He actually uses this word, the ordinary doctrine. And at the end of the text, the implied author asserts that a reader of goodwill, and thus an open mind, will conclude in his favor. So that is the case that the author of the first edition of Natural Origin of Species makes to his audience. Now, we're going to go back to the real Darwin in connection to real readers. Darwin's defenders were very alert to an objection that they'd heard a lot, both from opponents of Darwin and from proponents of him, that natural selection implies a selector, and so is itself a disguised form of creationism, and so doesn't count as real natural science. Do you see the force of the objection? Every act of selection implies a selector, so that selector must be something analogous to God, or must be God. So it's a disguised form of creationism and doesn't really count as natural science. For this reason, Darwin's defenders urged him to replace natural selection with the term survival of the fittest, which I'm sure is a phrase that you've heard. At first he was very reluctant to do it, but in the last two editions, he half-heartedly complied. And I'm going to argue that there were big consequences of this. I'm going to argue that when natural selection is seen as the survival of the fittest, something is really lost. Competition within and between species, which Darwin says occurs all the time, he calls it the struggle for existence. When you see natural selection as survival of the fittest, it makes natural selection might look more pointless and less providential, more violent even, than in the first edition. Because you're drawing attention to the struggle and not to the way in which, as Darwin says, nature adds up all the variants that keep species adapted. You're saying it's just struggle and extinction. So instead of defending the analogy between the reader's art and natural selection, Darwin now says that the metaphor can be replaced by literal descriptions of competition and selection, or actually in this case, elimination. So from that point of view, the elimination of the unfit rather than the continuous creation of the fit or adapted comes to the fore. And so one of the results of this shift in later editions, 5 and 6, is that Darwinism has had ever since to contend with this bloody, pointless, violent, and irreligious process, which was the very opposite of what he originally intended. And here I want you to bear in mind that he always thought that his defenders were arguing the same thing he was. And so he never said, back off, stop. We've got to go back to the analogy with breeders and look at this process positively. No, he just sat there and took it. So he begins to reply to the many objections that come by defending himself. The implied author, I say here in the second line, the implied author of the 6th edition is much less patient about the implied audience, more combative, more defensive, more assertive. And in fact, the new implied author in the 1870s is now more like the increasingly embattled real author. And as a result, the real author tends to become agnostic about God's providential care. He never says he's an atheist, but he becomes more agnostic over time. The word agnostic, by the way, was in fact invented by one of these defenders. It was actually invented by who? Huxley. Thomas Henry Huxley invented that word. So let's think about it for a minute. The implied author is now more like the increasingly embattled real author. Meanwhile, Darwin is getting older. And I want you to look at this picture and compare it to the young man who went out on this voyage across the world on the Beagle. He looks like a more troubled man. Here's my conclusion. The rhetoric of science approach to the text invites us to appreciate the fact that metaphors are not always replaceable without loss of meaning. If you do that, you're going to disturb your argument in big ways. So you shouldn't think of metaphors as decorative things that can be taken off of a discourse and replaced by other things. Sometimes you use metaphors that way to make things clearer to an audience. Physicists who have a very hard time explaining what they're doing are very fond of making up analogies and metaphors. But if you really look carefully in very important scientific texts, you'll find that the arguments actually are depending on the metaphor. And that if you take the metaphor out and replace it with literal descriptions of the processes, you lose something. You lose something essential to the argument. In fact, what you lose very often is the explanatory value of metaphors. For example, here's just one example. Darwin's metaphor of artificial selection, the analogy between artificial selection and natural selection, invites us to see that artificial selection, or the art of the breeder, is possible only because natural selection is operating in the background. So we know that artificial selectors picked the best of the litter, but that we didn't know why it worked. By understanding the theory of natural selection, you can understand why human beings can introduce such changes into wild type animals and plants and turning them into domestic ones over a period of time. I realize that in recent years, because of genetic technology, that time is being speeded way up. But it still, I don't think that makes any difference for the point. The breeder's art enables you to see things, the analogy enables you to see things that are very important to the natural selection. And they will also enable you to see something of the piety and the respect, almost the theism with which Darwin originally approached his task. And that, rather than the idea of nature being read in tooth and claw, or natural selection merely being an eliminative process, or merely being random, or whatever, you need to focus on this analogy in order to see the beauty of the argument of the origin of species. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions and respond to your comments.